denne.
You need to keep it real close. It's unmuted.
I'll also tell you if you're not close enough. I'm gonna get used to it. So, but like almost your lips should almost touch it. So.
Good evening, everyone. Do you hear me? Brilliant. Okay, so we invited for a pub night about Ukraine. But this is also our first live podcast for Ukraina-podden. So it will be taped as a podcast as well. So you'll hear podcast stuff. We haven't started yet because, like we always do, Tormod will do the introduction to the podcast when we start. So we're going to have two panels. We have two guests here, and we're going to have two guests a bit later, and then we open up for questions from the audience in the end. Even closer, like this, like whispering. This is, yes, brilliant. If you're randomly here and suddenly we start having a podcast here, I'm sorry for the rest of you. I'm very happy to see that there are so many people here that are interested to hear about Ukraine on a Thursday night. So I think we're ready. Are you ready to do the podcast start?
Yeah, I'm good.
Good. All
you
right.
ready?
I'm ready. Just to feel the sort of pro-Ukraine crowd here, let's try one. Slava Ukraini. That's good, but let's do it one more time. Slava Ukraini. Brilliant. Then we have the energy we need to start.
Amazing. Thank you. Welcome to Ukraina-podden. It's 777 days since Russia started the full-scale invasion against Ukraine. The war started in 2014, and I'm very happy to be here with my co-host.
Jørgen Henriksen. I'm a Ukraine writer at Nettavisen and also the leader of the Norwegian-Ukrainian Friendship Association.
And it's also a big honor and a big pleasure to welcome back Olena Halushka. Welcome back to Ukraina-podden.
Thank you.
And also to welcome our guest Irina Krasnosta.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, we have to talk really close. So you're all the three of you are too shy. You have to talk like me. You should almost be able to touch the microphone with your lips.
And if you're listening to this as a podcast, all the noise you're hearing is applause because this is our first live podcast. And I would like to thank Stopp, Pressen, which has been really excellent in hosting this and been very service-oriented. So if you would like to have an event like this, contact them, and they're excellent.
Yeah. So Olena, last time you were here, we talked a lot about seizing the frozen Russian assets, and I think we can say that you're not done yet, but you come a little step closer. Is that right to say?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much to everybody who came here for Thursday? Yes, Thursday night. It's a little bit untypical format for me, but I'm ready to preach Ukrainian victory, at all of the platforms available and not available. So thank you very much.
If you're going to influence Norwegian public opinion, then a pub is a good place to start.
Yes, probably yes. Yes, indeed, we've been working on confiscating frozen Russian assets very actively over the last month. And indeed, we are a step closer. Well, I wouldn't say it may be like a huge step, small one, but maybe we set ambitious goals, and that's why, it looks like a small one. But we indeed have progress in terms of the European Union use of the windfall profit taxes. Windfall profits. And that's, this I'm speaking about the profits which European institution Euroclear has made at the assets around almost 200 billion euros that were frozen there, specifically Russian central bank assets. And the decision which European Union is going to finalize soon, hopefully till June, is to send to Ukraine all those windfall profits starting from 2024. We speak about around 3 billion euros. But where are the windfall profits earned in 2022-2023? And the amount, the sum we speak about is 5 billion euros. It was kept by this Belgian institution, Euroclear, as the reserve fund for some hypothetical risks. And just today, our colleagues in Brussels had a rally demonstration near Euroclear office with the demand to transfer those 5 billion euros to Ukraine as soon as possible, because it's incomparable. Some hypothetical risks, which mostly regard the lawsuits in the Russian courts, which are kangaroo courts, you do not have rule of law there, comparing to dangers that are facing people of Kherson, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, and 5 billion euros, that's 2 systems, Patriot, and 750 missiles. That's plenty of air defenses, which could be saving Ukrainian lives.
Because that's one of your most acute needs right now, isn't it? To get more air defense, like both the Patriot systems, but also more rockets to it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in March, Russia intensified their air terrorism. They particularly target Ukraine's energy system. And Kharkiv is in the direst situation because Russians destroyed fully its energy system, all of the energy facilities. Just imagine 1 million people city, it's huge, is left without electricity and heating. If electricity, is, our energy magicians, they are somehow trying to connect it to the generating facilities in the region, heating is a very big problem, because if it is not fixed within the next half a year, then 1 million residents city will enter the winter, and winters in Ukraine are very cold, probably not as cold as here in Norway, but still
I think
very
it's on
cold.
the same level, kind of, depends on where in Norway you are, but the winters in Ukraine, they are
very
indeed.
cold, that's true. I mean, that would be a huge humanitarian catastrophe. And just today, Russians destroyed a thermal power plant near Kyiv. 2 weeks ago, they destroyed, or 3 weeks ago, Dnipro hydro power station, several other hydropower station and thermal power station, and they are causing a huge humanitarian catastrophe. And I want to remind to you that several weeks ago, ICC, International Criminal Court, issued arrest warrants for 2 military officials, Russians, for the intentional attacks against Ukrainian critical energy infrastructure in winter last year. And they suspect this crime to be a crime against humanity. That's, it's huge. It's really huge when the ICC says something like that. And now we see Russia repeating the crime against humanity, online, and the world is watching. And President Zelensky asked, European partners, to borrow to us, to share, to rent their Patriot system or analogs, but Patriots are very important for Ukraine because they can shoot down ballistic missiles, and the tactical air defense systems cannot. They can work only against cruise missiles. So, and unfortunately, we are not seeing the response. And today, European Parliament rejected the budget request from European Council, particularly with the demand that first European Council fixes the issue of Patriots for Ukraine and then comes to the EU asking for more money.
Yeah, and
Yeah, Elena, it's a couple of months since you were in the podcast the last time. If you mentioned a few examples now that aren't exactly they're not positive. Could you give us an overview of the trend or the situation in Ukraine right now? What has been the development in the last couple of months?
Well, unfortunately, the developments are not very good. Back in January, I was here in Oslo with the wake up call and with the message of the sense of urgency. And unfortunately, the urgency is even larger today than it has been in January. We still do not have any clarity with the American aid. I mean, the package stalled in Congress. Every time we hear that it's almost done, some cautiously optimistic signs, I don't know. For me, I would think that, it's cautiously optimistic when it is adopted in the Congress and signed by President Biden. Until then, I'm considering as the basic scenario that American aid is not coming and Europe has to substitute it, and Europe has to do this as soon as possible. We are seeing some good movements like the Czech initiative for the ammunition for Ukraine, or the initiative of Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas to get 0.25% of GDP for the support for Ukraine. Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg also came up with the idea of a 100 billion euro fund, US elections proof fund for Ukraine. But I mean, most of that, except Czech initiative, which is already underway, but the other initiatives, they are kind of a bit more long-term, and it's more about discussions at this stage. While Ukrainians do not have time for discussions, we need air defense systems and missiles to be on their way, transported to Ukraine already today. Because, as I've said already, in March, Russians were targeting particularly our energy system. For your understanding, they have destroyed 60% of Ukraine's generating capacities in the hydro and thermal power plants. I mean, we have as the basic left nuclear power plants, but Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is occupied, and it's 25% of all of the nuclear power plant generating capacity. So the situation with energy is very disturbing. Another super disturbing trend, which is hugely underreported in the international media, is Russian use of the glide bombs. They are very destructive. They are very powerful. I mean, they are of the size of 1.5 tons. Russians, added some wings to those bombs, which they have in stocks already, like almost, indefinite amount, lying there for decades in Soviet times. They are modernizing them, putting them on the fighter jets, and firing at Ukraine. And they are gliding 90 kilometers. Last year, they were gliding only 50 kilometers. So you can see that they are adapting and they are improving their killing machine and tactics. And the only way to fight, and they started to attack with those glide bombs 2 weeks ago, Kharkiv, which is super, super worrying, since that means that they might apply the Aleppo, Mariupol, Grozny scenario against this very large, second biggest city in Ukraine. And there is only one way to fight against those gliding bombs, because you cannot intercept them. When they are fired, they will land and they will destroy. So you can only scare away the Russian jets, more than 90 kilometers from Ukrainian front lines or Ukrainian borders, because they are applying glide bombs also in the Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv regions, the ones that are in the north, northeast, and east. So not only hot front line, but also border regions. And for that, to scare those jets away, you need modern fighter jets, and that's F-16. And to be honest, I'm kind of very frustrated because we've been speaking about those fighter jets since the first days of the full-scale war. And then we had, this finally political decision last spring, which was very delayed. But then we saw the delays at each and every stage of implementation of the F-16 deliveries to Ukraine. And now they are expected somewhere in June. We still do not know whether they will arrive and in which amounts. I mean, how many jets will arrive. And that is scandalous because, until June, with the destruction intensity that Russia already has, they can create very many damages, which would cost tens of billions of dollars to repair. And what is even more important, they can kill a lot of people because just yesterday, over one day, Russia killed 3 kids in Ukraine, 2 girls and 1 boy. I mean, the situation is in dire need, and it requires the actions, not only words, not only discussions, not only debates, but real actions now.
And it's been constant delays with the F-16's fighter jets. Like last summer, maybe I think we some people are talking about that Ukraine might get their F-16s in December 23, January 24, and now we're not sure if they're even arriving in June. What do they tell you? Like, what takes so long? Why does it get postponed every time? Do you know?
Well, we are hearing a lot of different, reasons, trainings, kind of maintenance. But I mean, if there is the political will to do the things quickly, they can be done quickly. Because even the trainings, to start the trainings, it took a few months, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say that it's still lack of political will to provide the tools for Ukraine to win this war and not only to survive, because that's the result, the dire situation in which we are today is the result of the Western approach to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, without the clear explanation takes what, instead of whatever is needed for the Ukrainian victory as soon as possible.
Yeah, it took Norway to half a year to say that we're contributing to the F-16 training program until we had some jets in Denmark. So I think we said that in July during the next summit in Vilnius, and January 3rd or 4th we sent the jets to Denmark to start the training. So only there it took half a year before we had Ukrainian pilots being able to train in F-16 fighter jets. And I think in late March or early April, the US, I'm not sure which part of the US government gave the thumbs up, but they gave the thumbs up for 22 Norwegian F-16s to be sent to Ukraine. But we're not sure how many of them which are flyable. Like, we're pretty sure that 12 of them are in really good condition, and the 10 last we're not sure. But at least you have 22 kind of plane bodies pretty soon, hopefully.
Well, that's very good, but we also have to understand that the radars of those planes need to be very powerful, because if they are not better than of the mix which we used to have, then they might not be super helpful with, fighting against the glide bombs. So I would assume, and I really hope, that the modernization of those jets, to not only have them flyable, but to have them appropriate to the Ukrainian needs, is being done.
For sure, because if you don't have the good radars, you just have a very expensive a plane that's good for showing, show off, which
Exactly.
does not save any lives.
Exactly.
Yeah, I really hope that one of the things that has delayed those aircraft deliveries are that they have changed the radars in them, because the Norwegian F-16s, which are the same block and type as the other F-16s that combined are 65 aircraft that are being delivered to Ukraine, with their old setup, they would be helpful against those glide bombs that has a range of 50 kilometers, but they would be inept for a 90-kilometer range. So to be able to stop those glide bombs, they actually need to have had this radar upgrade. And we have no information if that's happened or not, but I sincerely hope so. But back to the energy situation and the potential attack on Kharkiv, and it's about 1 million people that lives in Kharkiv now, isn't it? And there's a very direct line from that to Norway, because you travel all over Europe, but since we're in Norway now, let's focus on Norway. Before we came here, we had a meeting with the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament and talked about Norwegian aid, and there's perhaps a political will to increase the Nansen program, but it won't be a massive increase. And at the same time, the Nansen program is about 75 billion kroners, which is about 7.5 billion euros. That is similar to the amount of money that we are spending on Ukrainian refugees coming to Norway. And if Kharkiv is threatened, which is 1 million people, or if the energy grid in Ukraine collapses, the amount of refugees that are going to flow into Europe and also Norway is going to have a cost that is monumental. It is going to be so big that it is much cheaper to invest in Ukraine's ability to win this war. So after having this meeting, you've been in Rome and Paris before you came here. What is your gut feeling after those conversations on Europe's ability to counter the lack of support that is coming from the US?
After the US aid package was blocked in the US Congress last September, I visited France twice. First time in November last year and second time last week. And back in November, I had the feeling that, we were speaking a lot to different European partners, and particularly in Germany a lot. And I had the feeling that, entire Europe was very much scared. I would even say somehow paralyzed with the prospects of lack of American leadership, lack of American guarantees, for the Europeans' defense and security. But even back then in November, France already saw the opportunity, because the vacuum of leadership cannot stay empty. And, somebody might be nervous with regards to changing of the usual business, but the others see the opportunity for their own leadership. So for me personally, the statements and the policies of President Macron, which he publicly announced in February and is promoting ever since, was not surprising. Well, I was actually waiting for that to happen. And I would say that it was not an overnight shift, because it was the decision of Macron which eventually unblocked, Ukraine's EU candidate status, when there was this overnight train trip of Chancellor Scholz, Italian Prime Minister Draghi, and President Macron to Kyiv. And Draghi was very supportive. Macron was hesitating, and Scholz was, as always, against. That's his default stance towards all things Ukraine. And it was the decision of President Macron that eventually helped to convince Chancellor Scholz and Prime Minister Rutte, who was the last foremost skeptical regarding the EU candidate status. So the decision of President Macron indeed played a very important role. Then it was France which made the decision for the first among the European, G7 heavyweighters, to supply to Ukraine modern tanks, but light tanks, not modern battle tanks, but a kind of a smaller version. Then it was France and UK who decided to send longer range missiles, Storm Shadow and Scalp, to Ukraine, which are already, doing miracles. And it was France who supported invitation to NATO before Vilnius summit. So during our trip to Paris, we checked with the different stakeholders, both from the government and think tank, academia, how they assess the sincerity of those statements and actions. And my gut feeling said, and the information I collected is that that it's for real, that France really understands the risks, the dangers which Russia poses to the entire Europe, not only to Ukraine, and they see strong, sovereign, democratic Ukraine as the eastern flank of both European Union and NATO. So I think that the idea of President Macron to have this coalition of willing, coalition of courageous countries who are not focusing on the red lines, but instead, who are considering all of the possible scenarios and all of the possible ideas that are on the table, to be very good. But it has to be the coalition. It cannot be France alone. And that's why we hope that the UK will join. We very much hope for the Nordic and Baltic states because, your states, from my perspective, have a very sober analysis and understanding of what Russia is and what is Russian threat. And we think that it's a good way forward because, unfortunately, the existing structures, let's say as NATO, or even European Union with their consensus approach, they create a lot of the issues for the decision makers. And, somebody was joking in Paris whether European Union has enough coffee for Orban for all of the, decisions on Ukraine's EU accession, because current methodology of the EU accession foresees unanimous voting for opening chapters, setting conditionalities, and benchmarks, closing chapters, which is like more than 60 voting, I guess. That means that, if Orban keeps his veto powers, then, it would, at a certain point, put entire accession process in the deadlock because Orban won't be negotiable. So, long story short, I think that the idea of the coalition of willing is very good. It's very lively, but we need more countries to join it and to act proactively. And we truly hope that Norway would be the active member of this coalition of willing countries.
Yeah, and you, Katarina, you're working to get sorry, one more time. Irena, sorry, I wrote the wrong name down. Irena, you might also have to struggle with Orban because you have been working for many years to get Ukraine into NATO. And can you kind of tell me how the path has been? Because it started in 2008 in Bucharest, when NATO said that Ukraine should one day become a member state, but you're still not, and I guess that's the big end goal, isn't it?
Yes. So actually, if we talk a little bit now on NATO-Ukraine relations, the relations between NATO and Ukraine started even earlier. Basically, from the moment Ukraine gained its independence, it started to cooperate with NATO. But as you rightly mentioned, 2018 is like one of the big milestones in the relations. And I think 2008 was actually like a real window of opportunity where historic decision could have been made. And if you look back and look at what Putin's rhetoric have been around that time in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, Putin was actually quite clear about his intentions towards Ukraine. And it is very unfortunate that he was not fully listened to. And I think that if we actually look at everything that happened, that this is one of the mistakes and that keeps repeating, that the threat is there. It's been really articulated quite openly, and then no one listens to it. So unfortunately, in 2008, we were not given the invitation, and the actually membership action plan was introduced, and there was this decision that at some point Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. We still live with this decision. We still, I mean, it's still been quoted and continues to be quoted so many years after. And, you know, I started personally working on NATO-Ukraine issues in 2012. And, you know, this open door policy, I have heard so, like, year after year after year. And to be honest, when you look at it, basically NATO says we have open door policy. Every country has a right to choose its own path and its own future. And, you know, 2012 was a different case. I'll come back to it later. But now, since 2014, Ukraine was quite clear where it wants to be. It has done quite a lot to get there. And yet we are unable to get there. And basically the person who holds the keys to NATO doors is Putin. And that's quite disturbing for me, that, you know, the nation does choose its future, but it cannot enter through that open door. But I mean, we are trying to go through doors, windows, through whatever, because I think that we understand very well that without NATO membership, there would be no sustainable security and peace in Ukraine. And actually, I hope that at some point, all NATO members would understand that there would be no sustainable peace in Europe as such if Ukraine is not in NATO. But coming back to 2012, we of course had different passes on our way to NATO. And 2012 is another example, well, actually not 2012, but that's the year I started working on the issues. But 2010 was the year when under our now fugitive former president Yanukovych, who is now somewhere in Russia, he decided that Ukraine doesn't need to join NATO, and he adopted the so-called non-bloc status. And this status was allegedly supposed to, you know, be a guarantee for us that, you know, while not going to join NATO, we will not go in to join anyone, and we will live peacefully. And guess what? It did not work out that way, because Russia basically started the war against Ukraine back when we were in our non-bloc status and when we did not aspire at that moment to join NATO. So I think that was, of course, the strategic mistake on our path, but it's also kind of understandable that this is no surprise that it happened when we had the president who is now in Russia taking this lead. And it is maybe not, of course, a surprise that at that time we had the Minister of Defense who held Russian passports, and we had a number of other high-level officials who had connections to Russia. So you can understand that the security of Ukraine at that time was really undermined. But since Russia started the full-scale, not the full-scale, the aggression and the occupation of Crimea, you know, actually, and since Ukraine realized of a mistake it made and it changed its course towards the aspirations to join NATO, quite a lot has been done. And you know pretty well, and it has been acknowledged by so many, you know, allies, I mean NATO allies, how wonderfully Ukraine has been working with all the NATO equipment it has. It's because Ukraine, since 2014, has been training with NATO forces, has been participating in different NATO exercises. It has also contributed to different NATO missions. So there has been a lot of work done, and basically it was also thanks to that work that in 2022 Ukrainian forces were in conditions and were able to actually fight so courageously against Russia. And everyone, always say in the meetings, and they all admire how bravely Ukrainians fight. And basically, I think many would agree, that Ukrainian forces in NATO would significantly increase the capacities of the alliance. I mean, I will not name the particular countries, but it could be perhaps no surprise to you that in some of the NATO countries, I mean, their feeling is that if they had been attacked as Ukraine was, they're not sure if their military would have been able to fight and against Russia in the way that Ukrainians are.
I think you're in one of those countries right now, actually.
I tried not to name, but I guess everyone guessed. But you are not alone. I mean, this is basically the situation in quite a number of countries, and that's the thing that I do remember that for a long time we were speaking about is Ukraine, will Ukraine benefit from NATO? Of course Ukraine would benefit from NATO, but it's important to remember that NATO would benefit from Ukraine, and especially from the experience. It is doing it already right now, and there was recently the decision to create a joint, I don't remember the full name, but it's Joint Analysis and Training and Education Center. I think it would be announced operational probably at the summit in Washington, but basically it's now being prepared to be launched. And the idea is that, of course, all the NATO countries would like to learn from Ukrainian experience. So they're doing it right now, but they want to make this work quite more sustainable. So it's not only NATO countries that are training Ukrainian forces right now, because there are a number of those Ukrainian military go there and are being trained, but it's also NATO member states who are learning from Ukraine. And actually, speaking about Macron and his brave ideas, of course, one of the issues that he announced was about not excluding sending troops to Ukraine, but actually, we do not necessarily say that we would like, Norwegians or any other NATO members to go and fight with Ukrainians in the trenches. But what would be needed, for example, would be not to have Ukrainian forces going to some of the NATO countries for the trainings, but for example to have NATO instructors doing this work in Ukraine. Because before the full-scale invasion, I don't know if everyone in this audience know, but there have been at least 3 not NATO missions, but bilateral missions from NATO member states working in Ukraine. I think either from 2014 or 2015. There was an American mission, Canadian mission, and a UK mission, to which I think Sweden was also contributing. And it was a very useful experience, because they were operating in Ukraine in a number of locations across Ukraine in military units, and they were training them according to NATO standards, practices, and so on. And when the full-scale invasion started, actually before that, when there were certain intelligence and so on, all those people from those missions were evacuated from Ukraine, and they are no longer operating in Ukraine, but they are operating in their countries. So, what NATO members could start with is actually deploy I mean, not deploy because this is a different term, but actually send some of the instructors back to Ukraine. It will save like time and logistic, you know, and all different means to some of the locations that are, I'm not saying in the eastern Ukraine, in some other places, and help Ukrainian forces train and you know, prepare
also
better.
I think the NATO countries would have a lot to learn from Ukraine, and I know that's been like a discussion in the US kind of military circles that they miss out a lot because they have no boots on the ground. Like they don't argue that they should go and fight, but they should be there with the Ukrainians to see how they fight, how the war has developed, because this is a war that no NATO country has any experience in fighting. Like NATO has never been in a war with which is like this, because this is the first kind of this war we see with drones and all the modern equipment. It's totally new, and I guess you can teach a lot during Zoom and Google Meets, but like you can't pick up the real field experience and get to see the persons that knows how to do it and stuff like that. So I know it's also like among the military personnel that think that it's a mistake that the NATO countries has like a policy not to have troops on the ground at all, even though there's some rumors that there's some French and British soldiers in a deep bunker somewhere fixing the storm shadows and the scalps, which we, of course,
We don't
Which
know.
may
We
not,
don't know.
which may or may not
Yeah.
be true.
that's
But coming to that point, yes, I mean, it's not through you know, online means. Ukrainian military go to some of them, at least, go to some of the NATO states where they train with, you know, that country's armed forces. But the situation is that quite often those are, let's say, those who are going through basic military training. So, of course, going to Ukraine and working with those who have quite extensive experience of fighting with Russia would have an immense added value. And most importantly, to also see how NATO equipment is being used by them. Because you probably know a lot of these stories, how, you know, Ukrainians are very innovative in the way how they use the NATO equipment, and they adapt quite a lot to the situation. So I think that would, of course, be beneficial. And that with that, we are now like coming back to the circle where you said about Hungary and Orban, and the fact that NATO operates under consensus. And it is no one else at this point as Norwegian, Jens Stoltenberg, who tries to, you know, like balance and find that consensus around. And I have honestly a lot of appreciation to the work that he's doing, but it's really, really difficult to balance between the countries who have very different views on the security situation, on the threat perceptions, and who have, sometimes just basically not very pro-Ukrainian or even pro-Western position, let's be honest. And I think that has been really difficult, and it had real influence on the decisions that NATO was able and was not able to take. And basically, Olena mentioned before this new initiative that Secretary General announced, which is, of course, I mean, we are welcoming any initiative that provides Ukraine with some support. And basically what Secretary General said at the very recent foreign ministerial meeting, basically meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs just recently, when they celebrated 75th anniversary of NATO in Brussels, he announced this initiative to first create the long-term fund in support for Ukraine, and second, to actually, I mean, they started discussions about how NATO can coordinate actually support to Ukraine. Meaning that perhaps they will switch from Rammstein, which is a US-led format, to like NATO coordination. And you know, I was fascinated in a way with this, because in my opinion, it is absolutely logical that NATO coordinates, but it was by far not able to do that because of the countries like Hungary and some others that could then veto some of the decisions. Because if no consensus is reached, nothing can go through. And perhaps, I mean, this was one of the reasons why originally this Ukraine contact group was led by US, because it was bilateral initiative and you didn't have to consult with all the nations sitting on the table. You can decide on whatever you want, and you can, get into your group the countries who are willing to support Ukraine. So switching, to a different format, I mean, we don't know yet how the discussions will go. I mean, hopefully they would find a way and the mechanism to kind of, I mean, it's impossible to overcome consensus in NATO because that's the basic principle of the work of the organization. So how they will create this mechanism and how they will implement would be crucial. So theoretically, this is a decision to be made in Vilnius, in DC summit this summer. We will see. But the problem is that between now and DC summit, we have a lot of time. So it's in July. So basically, there will be no decision until then from NATO, neither on that big fund, nor on this new format. But for us, what we keep talking about is that, and what we will try to pressure further, and perhaps you could also pressure further, is of course the invitation to NATO, because everything else is, additional. NATO membership for Ukraine is a key, and the invitation to join NATO would be the important step. And it's really unfortunate that, when we speak about the red lines that some of the countries introduces to themselves, it's also regarding the invitation to NATO, because basically there is the feeling that until Ukraine wins the war, until some sort of, settlement is reached, Ukraine will not be in NATO. But you have to understand that basically this gives the clear signal to Russia that it should never stop the war against Ukraine.
Just continue to, as long as they continue the war,
Exactly.
Ukraine is never going to access NATO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, Putin will never stop, and then Russia will never stop, even with or without Putin, fighting against Ukraine, because that's a guarantee for them that Ukraine will never be in NATO. So it's a vicious circle. And then, you have to think about how to, break the vicious circle, and think as we mentioned, like create, as Macron did, even with your decision, NATO has the capacity to create, this clear signal that Putin cannot win in Ukraine. Because if they give invitation, is not membership. So invitation, some of your neighbors know that very well, that once you're invited to NATO, you can join quicker and you can join a little bit later, as with, Finland and Sweden. For Ukraine, it can be even longer, but it would be a very clear signal for Ukraine, and it would be a very clear signal for Russia.
Sure.
Right. We're going to have two. We're going to have two more guests up in the panel, so we're going to do the switch now, and then we're going to head into a Q&A session. So while you are stepping down and our other guests come up, but I think in the meantime, I'm going to say that you touched upon some very interesting issues, and 2008 was a very important year. It's been 90 years, but scholars are still debating actions by the West in the 1930s and whether or not World War II could have been averted. And I think 2008 is going to be the year that we, for the next 100 years, discuss whether or not we made a massive mistake. And I think we did, because the thing that we did was that we said, Georgia and Ukraine should be in NATO at some point, just not right now. And the direct consequence of that was that Putin invaded Georgia, and we started this snowball towards where we are now. But we have two more guests. First, Katerina Butko, is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah,
almost.
almost.
It's okay.
Why don't you repeat it so it's correct?
My name is Katerina Butko.
Butko.
And Katerina, I'm sorry, I have to stress the talking into the microphone. It's very feels very unnatural to almost kiss the microphone while you talk. But makes the one in the back able to listening to us, and also the people listening to the podcast version. So I'm sorry for being the one nagging about it.
But your work on an issue that is is an important part of the debate in Norway, and well, the Russian trolls online are always nagging about this, but it's an important issue, and we have to be honest. It's still a massive issue in Ukraine. You work with anti-corruption. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Yes, I think you heard many information about war in Ukraine, and we really thank you that you come here to hear even more and more information, and we're really grateful for this. But maybe you don't know that even during full-scale war in Ukraine, we are still make reforms, continuous make reforms, and our beer is much cheaper than yours. But if we are back to talking about reforms, I'm not talking about some small, partly reforms. I'm talking about really comprehensive reforms like judicial, anti-corruption, law enforcement reforms. It's still ongoing now in Ukraine. For example, even if we are talk about judicial reform, I can say that in last 2 years, after full-scale war, we may have achieved even more than the previous 8 years.
Yeah, and that's really impressive, actually. I think you climbed 2 ranks the last year, was it? Like in the global corruption index, which you want to climb that index. Like you don't. So Ukraine has become much less corrupt during the last 2 years than before. So that's really impressive, because that's a narrative that's kind of thrown around from Russia, that Ukraine is such a corrupt country and that all the aid to Ukraine is going to Zelensky's mansions all around Europe, and other troll stories like that. But I think it's really impressive how Ukraine has intensified its war against corruption during its war against Russia. And how is that possible? Like, how do you do that while you're fighting to survive as a nation, but you're also able to have less corruption in the society?
Yes, we created some special and independent anti-corruption ecosystem with anti-corruption bodies like National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialization Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and High Anti-Corruption Court. Those body was created before full-scale war, and now they are working. But still, some parts of reform, for example, judicial reform, they are take place after full-scale war. For example, we reboot to the key bodies in judicial system is High Qualification Commission of Judges and High Council of Justice. This is like something like HR department of all judicial system, because both of those body should appoint more than 2,000 judges and consider qualification assessment more than 2,500 judges, and they can dismiss the old one. I trying to find information how many judges are in Ukraine or in Norway, but really I can't find those information. I only find information that in your Supreme Court you have 22 judges, and to see the difference, in our Supreme Court there's 200 judges. Of course, 50 place now is vacant, but 150 judges work there. So it's in all system we have near 5,000 judges in Ukraine. So almost a year ago, we have one of the biggest corruption scandal that the head of Supreme Court was arrested on a $2.7 million bribe. And someone can say that, oh my God, it's really terrible that during the war some judge takes such a huge bribe. And I agree with this person, it's really terrible. But on the other hand, if you ask somebody in Ukraine, could they imagine 10 years ago that somebody like police or prosecutors will arrest the head of Supreme Court? They will answer that no, it's no way. They are not touchable person, and even if somebody try to do it, they only take them to the police or prosecutors the small part of those bribes, and they close this case. But now it's possible in Ukraine, and I believe that in few years we will have a court decision about those judges, about the head of Supreme Court. So we already have almost 34 decisions about judges that takes bribes, and those decisions we have in the last 4 years, but before it we have 0-1. So we are trying to do our best.
I think this is a really important point. And first of all, it's very impressive that you've had this kind of reforms during wartime, because we were supposed to have a reform of our court systems, and then we decided not to, and we're not at war. So, but you touch upon something. It's a phrase that I think is extremely interesting because it explains a lot. And Olena taught me that it's the transparency paradox. Because you live in that right now in Ukraine, because you have all these arrests, and every time you arrest someone, then the critics say, "Oh, look at that! There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine." But the other way of looking at it is that, well, you actually have a judicial system that works. You arrest people that are corrupt. And when Tormod and I visited Ukraine in February, we spoke to people in bars and stuff, and they said, that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. If somebody was trying to smuggle out 10 million across the border, then, and if they were stopped, they would just give 1 million to the border guard, and then it wouldn't be a problem. But now they are arrested, and it happened, and then they go into the court system. So the fact that corruption is seen in Ukraine and people are arrested, that must be, at least in part, a good sign.
Yes, you should understand that during Yanukovych time, the level of corruption was much more higher, but nobody, everyone knew that Ukraine was corrupted country, as there was corruption in Ukraine, but even we in Ukraine didn't know the full scale of this corruption, because nowadays we have open data, we have great investigator journalists, and all those information about arrest, about corruption and everything. You can find it almost every week, and to see it very often. But 10 years ago, if you look to the news in Ukraine, you can find information that we have new panda born in the zoo, something like that. Not about corruption. Nobody's talking about corruption.
Panda is kind of a big deal, though.
Yeah, and also, sorry, I also think there's a story running now with investigative journalist in Ukraine that was kind of threatened from someone from the SBU. Is that correct? If I've not been diving deep into that story, but he was threatened somehow by this soldier. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was such a case.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Like, do you think that would happen 10 years ago? Like that there would be open the case against the soldier or the people making the threats, or is it?
Unfortunately, it's more closer to the situation in those questions. The situation is more closest is what was happened 10 years ago that should be happen now today in Ukraine.
Yeah, but you're still like it's made official and it's like
yes,
open
at least it's
investigation
official.
against it. Which
yes. And at least we have some reaction from those bodies, for example.
Yeah. So what's the biggest challenge you face when you're fighting against corruption in Ukraine and in the justice system? Like, I understand it's very lucrative to be corrupted, and if you like, but what's the biggest challenge you face when you want to get rid of the corruption?
I can name a few. For example, the key for good reforms is a transparent selection process. Nowadays, all those bodies that we are rebooted, the members they selected by the High Integrity Commission that include international experts, and it's really very important because before it was totally political appointment, or judges, for example, appointment the member of High Council of Justice who can fire them. So there was total conflict of interest. But nowadays we have transparency competition when we have live broadcast all the interview with the candidates, when we can find all the information about those candidates to see their declaration, for example, and send those information to the select commission. So it's really important and big challenges to have such competition. But the second challenges is the people, high qualification people, because, for example, nowadays the reform of constitutional court also ongoing in Ukraine, and the biggest problem that we see now is that not many integrity and professional candidates came to this competition, and what we see is quite low level of the candidates, and the constitutional court is crucial because it's the court that can break down any reforms, any ideas. So that's why the biggest problem is to find good integrity and professional candidates, both of them. But we have problem with people, with professional people, not only in traditional or anti-corruption system now in Ukraine. It's a big problem because many people are mobilized, many people in army, and they cannot possible to them to come to this competition. So we have problem with people. I think it's the most challenging with professional people.
And that goes into the why there's so controversial to lower the mobilization age and mobilize more people to the army, I guess. But that's a whole nother discussion. We should talk about next time we are here. And now, thank you, Katarina. Now I want to talk more with you, Olga Kobilivaka. Sorry, is that good?
Kobylinska.
I have to
public name.
check my notes better next time before I go on stage.
In our very first podcast, I was supposed to say Novo Provopivka, and it took a bit of practice, and you always have to do a bit of a leap. And even though I've worked on Ukrainian issues since 2004, all these names, I'm sorry, it's difficult
okay,
for us.
We will never pronounce your name as well.
Thank you. So yeah, but you're from Media Initiatives for Human Rights.
Yes.
I got that right?
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's 1 point at least. But yeah, you're working on grim stories from how it is to live under Russian occupation in the occupied parts of Ukraine, and also how the prisoners of war are treated, and also the civilian prisoners, because there's a lot of civilians, detained.
Thank you for this, and let me say that it is maybe the most unusual place to talk about human rights and in terms of war. But I'm so surprised that so many people are listening so attentively about our problems. Thank you very much for that. That means a lot for us because, you know, we all feel like the interest to Ukraine and to war in Ukraine becomes law and like seeing you here is very important for us. Thank you for that. Back to our work. Our organizations and many other human rights organizations in Ukraine had been documenting the war crimes since the very beginning of the war, which started in 2014. And our organization was established by former journalists, me and my colleague Maria Tomak, back in 2016, especially for investigating war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine, because, you know, not many of you maybe have heard about the war crimes in Ukraine before the large-scale invasion, but it doesn't mean that there were no war crimes. During the annexation of Crimea, there were enforced disappearances in Crimea, there were arbitrary detentions, and people were detained and tortured and so on. And there was a film where Putin, Russian propagandist film, where Putin said that Crimea annexation happened with no drop of blood, but it isn't true because at least 43 people were missing during the annexation, during the so-called referendum in Crimea and so on. And then they spread these practices to the east of Ukraine, where a lot of torture chambers were established. But if you remember, at that time there were a lot of discussions whether it was like internal conflict in the east of Ukraine or international conflict, were there the signs of the Russian presence in Donbass or not. For us, Ukrainians, it was obvious that it is the Russian aggression. But for many internationals, including the International Criminal Court and others, it was not obvious. It was like a subject of discussions. And that's why our organization started to investigate those quasi-legal systems established in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions to prove the Russian effective control under those territories. And investigating those so-called officials appointed from Moscow in Donetsk and Lugansk and so on, we understood that those detentions of civilians, enforced disappearances, for Russians was a tool of establishing of occupational authorities. So they need to break the resistance of civilians, and they detained first, of course, activists, journalists, bloggers, representatives of local authorities. But you know, to keep people in fear, they need to do this regularly. So after the 2 years, 3 years of the occupation, they started to capture just random people. They need to do this because if they stop doing detentions, people will oppose them again. So when the large-scale invasion started, we understood that they're going to spread those practices into the newly occupied territories, but the scale of their crimes was surprising even for us. Only, you know, the northern regions of Ukraine were liberated 2 years ago, in the end of March of 2022. And we really knew that there were detentions in the occupied territories, for example, of the Kiev region. We knew that the famous Ukrainian journalist Dmytro Khiluk was detained in one of the villages in the occupation, but we didn't know about the number of those people detained. And just after the deoccupation of the Kiev region, we went to those villages to look for those people who were like missing, and we didn't find them. They were nowhere. So we started to conduct investigation and trying to identify where they are. And after the months of our investigation, we identified that they were transferred to the Russian Federation via Belarus. This is very important that Belarusian authorities are also involved in this crime. The same situation was in the Chernihiv region and in the Sumy region. People was detained. They were captured. They were held in some torture chambers in the occupied territories. And during the withdrawal of Russian army, they were taken to different prisons in the Russian Federation. First, it was across the Russian-Ukrainian border in Bryansk, Belgorod, Rostov, and other cities. There were prepared prisons for Ukrainians. And then we understood that the same situation was in Kharkiv region, which was also occupied in the Kherson region. And so we understood that they detain people and transfer them to different prisons. So then they needed more and more places for captivity. And for now, we identified more than 100 places all over the Russian Federation where Ukrainian, both civilians and prisoners of war, are held. And now, we see how actively they transfer those people deeper and deeper inside Russia. And now we have our civilians kept in Barnaul, Taganrog, Orenburg, whatever, you can imagine, all over the Russian Federation.
And very close to the Norwegian border, we know that there are detained people and also kidnapped children that live in Murmansk, which is very close to Kirkenes in the high north. And this is also an issue that came up with a lot of people we spoke to when we were in Ukraine, and we have to understand this extreme conditions that are in the occupied territories when people ask for Ukraine to sort of give away territories to achieve peace. First of all, you can't believe Russia that they will stick to it. The other thing is that you condemn people to live in those conditions. And what stuck with me with the people we spoke to in Ukraine is that, well, it's not about the territory. We need to liberate our people because our people are trapped behind those lines. And that comes back to me when you talk about those kinds of oppressions. And now we're going to the open mic questions part. But quickly, shortly before that, you have a suggestion of something that could be done here in Oslo regarding this issue.
Yeah, thank you for this question. First of all, we have this peace formula, President Zelensky. Maybe you've heard about this. There are 10 points. We can discuss about effectiveness of those points, but the very important that the fourth point of this formula is about returning all the Ukrainian citizens to Ukraine. It means deported children, civilian hostages, and prisoners of war and deported people. So according to this formula, the international working group was created, and Norway together with Canada, took leadership in this working group, and we're grateful for this to the Norwegian government. But for now, it is very important to fill this working group with very practical steps. And we have an idea about creation the special center for release of civilian hostages here in Oslo. To our mind, it is very important to have it here in Oslo, because when it will be in Kiev, Moscow will never negotiate with anything that is based in Kiev. This is the obvious idea, but here in Oslo you have the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, which is very experienced organization, which worked in Caucasus and Balkans and other conflict situations. Also, this Norwegian Helsinki Committee has a very good database called IDOC. We contribute to this database with all the documented facts of war crimes that we have, and also the list of civilian detainees that we have. By the way, we have identified 1,660 civilian so-called hostages or detainees, but it's not the final number. We assume that this number can be much and much higher, and these people are slowly dying in Russian captivity. They are severely tortured. So, back into this idea of the Center for Release Hostages, we hope that Oslo can be the city and the place which can involve the professional negotiators for these purposes, to develop strategies for different groups of civilians captured by Russians. So we came here to call the Norwegian government to look at this idea and to think what can be done in this regard.
Brilliant. That's an excellent suggestion, and we will be sure to follow that up. So heading into the questions, and we're a very democratic and open society, but we're still sort of a clan culture. So we keep the jobs within the family. So I recruited my brother-in-law, Frode, to hand out the microphone for the questions. So while you raise your hand to indicate that you have a question, I've gotten one in by text. Brilliant. I've gotten one question in by text already. It's anonymous, and the question is, if TASS says that a panda bear has been born in Russia, would you believe it? And absolutely not. Then I believe it's a polar bear that's been painted partially black.
Poor panda.
Yeah.
To be born in Russian captivity.
You know, the Russians lie when they say hi. Okay, first question. And remember, we are on radio, so introduce yourself when you ask the question. Thank you.
I think I'll do the introduction here if you don't mind. It's not working, so Jon, maybe you could come up here. This is Jon Farseth, John Farseth, I guess is their international name. He just, last year, he published a book about the war in Ukraine, and you went all the way back to 2004. It's a really, really good book that gives a great explanation on how the war started. So if you have not bought it, I recommend you to buy it. So yeah, thank you, John, for coming, and please.
Yeah, well. Okay. Yeah, you said that there are deported Ukrainians now in the high north. I didn't actually know that. I've been wondering about that for a long time. But given that, what can and should Norway or Norwegian authorities do?
Thank you very much. There is a difference between deported people. There really are millions of Ukrainian civilians who were deported from the occupied territories, for example, from Mariupol and others. But we are talking about detainees, people who were detained, arbitrarily detained, and who are held incommunicado. They are isolated. Russians keep them secretly with any access to them. Nobody has this access, including the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. About what can Norway does in this regard, I think that as Norway already took this, has taken this leadership, I think the task of the Norwegian government is to think how we can involve different professional negotiators in this process. What instrument and tools we can use to influence Russians to let those people go, and that could be different instruments: economical, political, to make pressure, to establish more sanctions, to invoke different mechanism of accountability and others. So there could be different ways, but we need someone who can develop this mechanism, these strategies. Yeah, so this is the task for the Norwegian and Canadian government who took this leadership.
And also another thing that Norwegian governments, like local municipalities, could do is that every single one of Norwegian municipalities that still have a friendship city agreement with a town in Russia, you could cancel that. Because if we're going to have a relationship with Russia in the future that is functioning, it's up to Russia to fix it. It's not our task now to have friendship cities or exchanges.
Friendship with Russia is very dangerous, believe me.
Yeah. So if Russia is your friend, you should see someone
Big
professional. Okay.
Now we
Other
have-
questions?
Yeah. We have the microphone working now, so you don't have to come up on stage. So if you're afraid of that, you don't have to be anymore. So is there any more questions to the panel? I think, yeah, we have one here, very close one. So you just grab the mic and introduce yourself, please.
777 days ago, it was very impressive, the defense that Ukraine had to the Russian invasion. But I wonder, before that, the annexation of Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine, has there been any big discussion? How could that happen? What about the intelligence and so on, and letting such a huge part of Ukraine been taken over? Has it led to any big political uprising or discussion, like Netanyahu meets in Israel after 7th October, for instance?
You mean Ukrainian intelligence, or yeah, maybe my colleagues have an ideas, or international?
Both. You should be better prepared, I guess.
Yep.
You mean in 2022 or 14?
Yeah. May I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will share some of my thoughts. I have talked a little bit about that because we need to put things into historic, let's say, perspective, because this happened at the moment. I explained that Yanukovych was in power. We had quite a lot of Russian, even like people with Russian passports sitting in the highest positions. And you can imagine that they did quite a lot to deteriorate the situation in which our armed forces were. So, to be honest, in 2013, we were completely in a different situation than we were in 2022. Then the other thing is that, I mean, this has happened just, at the same moment when we had the Revolution of Dignity. So we had the let's say, the most bloodiest days at the Maidan at that time. People were killed. I mean, if I recall correctly, some of the officers who then in Russia received the medals for the occupation of Crimea, the medals were dated with 20th of February of 2014. 20th of February is the day on which the bloodiest killings on Maidan happened. So we were, let's say, I mean, I will honestly say that we were all in a really fragile situation. Then the president, as you know, flew to Russia. Then we had like interim government. We had to prepare for the election. So of course Russia, and it's also coming back, it's not a surprise that they chose certain momentum in the current full-scale invasion, but it was not a surprise that they chose that exact date to attack. It was the moment when Ukraine was really weak. It was vulnerable. It has lived at that time what we felt, because I think all of us sitting here, we were all part of the Revolution of Dignity. We were all there. We were all, trying to fight for the better future. And for us, the days at the Maidan were seemed the most dramatic. We didn't know at that time, of course, what awaits us. And basically, that's about what was happening in Ukraine. The other thing is how the Western the West reacted to that. You remember this green little man, and everyone was very surprised. Who are those people? We knew that they are Russians, but everyone tried to not fully understand that they are Russians. And basically, at that point, and let us remind ourselves that in 2008, Russia already started to occupy Georgia, and the Western world did not react as well to that. So then in 2014, the Western world did not react appropriately, and basically, Putin found a very nice soil for his attack on Ukraine. Then in the eastern Ukraine, the situation was a little bit different. You know that there was already some fighting. Then what was then known as anti-terrorist operation started. But of course, I mean, we were in a different shape then. And the West basically allowed that to happen. And this is quite unfortunate that, we still see the reaction, of course, to 2022 was different. But, it's surprising that already 2 years in the full-scale invasion and more than 10 years in aggression of Russia, we still need to explain to different countries, to different people, what is happening, what is at stake, what Russia does. And there's still those who do not believe, who still thinks that they can do business with Russia and then come back to normal.
Olena also wants to elaborate on that question.
Well, I'll be very brief, but I want to add basically on the second part, which Irena has touched upon. If you recall the world's response, then the occupation of Crimea, the occupation of parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast were absolutely neglected by the West until MH17 flight was shut down. Only at that moment, Western partners applied the first set of sanctions. So everybody was basically watching almost live how Russia is occupying, grabbing the land and territory, violating the international order without doing anything, denying us weapons, not applying any sanctions, literally, letting everything happen. So from my perspective, and I would say that it is much more important to talk how the countries that were operational at that moment when the war started responded to it, because Ukraine, and colleagues explained very well, wasn't very much, operational at that moment. But why European Union, US, and all of the other partners decided this to happen and therefore green-lighted further aggression? That's, from my perspective, the largest question.
And sorry, if I may, I will just add one additional point, because we forgot something important. There was a Budapest memorandum that some countries, including Russia, including US, signed with Ukraine when Ukraine became independent. It had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, and it gave up that weapons in exchange for the guarantees for its own security. And basically what we found out in 2014, that first of all, one of our guarantors of security bluntly occupied us, and then the other guarantors of our security just pretended it did not happen.
Yes, and we're getting to the end now, so we're going to have 2 more questions. You have to come up. So Bjørn Johan Berger and Erlend Drottninghaug come up here for the question. There's another one there, but the microphone isn't working, so come up here. But to add to that, now that we're speaking in English, we have a global audience, but for those that live in Norway, an excellent thing about living in Norway is that our news are archived online. So you can go in on NRK and watch Dagsrevyen from 2014, and see what's on the news there. Because it's very interesting. You have, on the day that the incursion into Crimea starts, there's an expert on TV saying that, well, this is just Putin rattling his sables. It will not amount to anything. And here we are, 10 years later. Bjørn Johan, your question.
Well, I think that much of this war is also about developing Ukraine to be a successful democracy. And part of the development, I think it's important that you have real critical media and independent media, and I guess especially when it comes to fighting corruption. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit about how it was like in 2014, how it's today, and if it's much that or more that should be done regarding independent media and journalism in Ukraine.
And if you keep the answers brief, we'll get to all the questions before we end.
Just a remark, we have to realize that the corruption we have in Ukraine is the part of Russian world. It is like spread since Soviet Union, and all those oligarchs, all those cancer, which this corruption is. It's like the way how Russia keeps influence on Ukraine. So to defeat corruption in some way means to defeat Russian world inside Ukraine. So for us, this struggle is also very important.
You already answered for this question that yes, the situation changed, and nowadays we have much more independent medias. But it's not only because the political situation changed, but it's also because nowadays we have media in Facebook, YouTube, and so on. And in 2014, it wasn't such a popular. So nowadays we have many investigating journalists, and if we look back in 2010 or 12, we have only the few one, and they were pressed by government.
Okay, next question here.
Hello, my name is Hans Melby, and I'm very passionate about European military history. And I've seen quite a few people make comparisons with the war in Ukraine, with the Second and the First World War, and of course, and I also seen people compared Putin to Hitler. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about these comparisons that has been made, particularly about how, like I've seen some people say that Putin's bitterness over the collapse of the Soviet Union is similar to Hitler's bitterness over the Treaty of Versailles, which was made at the end of the First World War.
This is a very good question. Maybe my colleague will answer another way, but as for me, we're talking not only about Putin. Unfortunately, it would be much easier than we have just Putin, who is ruling this war, who is willing to fight with Ukraine, to occupy, to invade different countries. But unfortunately, there are very big part, I think, the majority of Russians who are supporting these invasions. Not only in Ukraine, they are supporting those, those threats to Europe, to NATO, and so on. So just to dismiss Putin, it won't solve the problem or get us anything. We have to deimperialize the whole Russian population, the entire Russian population, and this is a huge challenge for every country and for the whole humanity. But yeah, you are right in that this is like a threat like before the Second World War. We are at the stage like in 1938, let's say, and there are a lot of parallels, like a weakness of political leadership in the world, like threats in different countries and so on. There are a lot of parallels, but the threat is even bigger because we have a nuclear power, and we have China who supports Russia, and we see how Russia and China are building the network of dictatorships, and this will be a very big coalition, let's say. So, yeah, this is a big challenge.
If I may just shortly, in addition to what you said, I think Putin can also be compared to Stalin, because a lot of what he does resembles to what Stalin was doing, because, you know, Ukrainians suffered from Stalin a lot, and I think the fact that Stalin's regime was never recognized as, you know, crime, as you know, also aggression, I think that actually nurtured what Russia is, and I agree, it's not about Putin only, but what Russia is today.
I think there are a lot of parallels through these things, and I'd like to quote Olena from earlier today at the Helsinki committee. She said that it's up to the West to decide whether or not the war in Ukraine is the first battle or the last battle of World War III. And you're absolutely going to love the episode that we taped earlier today that we're going to release this weekend, which was fully about the parallels between the war in Ukraine and the civil war in Spain directly ahead of World War II. So watch out for that. It's in Norwegian. But we're getting to the final question of the night. Alan Drottninghaug, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jørn. And can I ask 2 questions? Is it possible?
Yeah, if you do it, if they're short and you do it in once.
Okay. Well, okay. I'll choose the first one I had on my list. So today we had 4 Ukrainian women speakers, female speakers at the panel, and I have noticed through my interest in the war in Ukraine and Ukraine in general that women take a very big part in society in general in Ukraine compared to many other countries in Europe in general, not just Eastern Europe in general. And I've also looked at, not studied very in depth, but looked at with focus on female combatants and also women taking part in the military complex as a whole. And I wondered if any of you have any thoughts about the future of women in the military, and also in connection with the fact that conscription is going to change now, and if there are any thoughts about that in the future. Here in Norway we have equal conscriptions between sexes. It means that not 50-50 are being conscripted, but the best of between all the group that are being called for as conscription. And actually, I'm quite proud that when that happened, I was actually in a part of the working group back in 2010 when we developed that law from the soldiers' perspective. It started on the grassroots of soldiers, female soldiers who wanted to be to have that law over them, to know that they were serving mandatory equally as the men. Because before that, and I think the law went into action like 2014. They were serving voluntarily as conscripts, but they didn't feel the same status. So I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about that. I would be very happy to hear them.
Thank you for your kind words towards the Ukrainian women, but I have to say that our best men are on the front line. So we have to do this.
And women as well.
And women as well, but yeah, unfortunately, men can't go abroad due to the martial law, and so yeah, but we have brilliant men as well. Be sure. Yeah, but yeah, really, and we don't have a deep problem with the inequality in Ukraine. We still have some, but I mean gender inequality, but when it comes to the armed forces, unfortunately, we do have this post-Soviet heritage in the in Ukrainian army, and it's not only about the gender equality, but it's about a lot of human rights things inside army. Before the large-scale invasion, I think it was in 2019, those limitations for women to take some positions in the army was like dismissed by the special law, and women were allowed to be like I don't know how to say it in English. Combat positions and so on. Now, if I'm not mistaken, more than 30,000 of women are served in the Ukrainian army, and many of them are snipers, are like deal with mortars and so on. They are combats, real combats. There are a lot of combat medics, and unfortunately, there are a lot of women in the Russian captivity, and this is our another pain, and you can just imagine what they do to Ukrainian combat women. So yes, my own opinion about the conscription, I think that yes, there should be equal conscription for both sexes, but for any gender, you know. But for example, it is a huge challenge for families. For example, my husband is serving in the armed forces. We have two kids, and so we have to decide who will be serving and who will be like defending human rights and so on. So yeah, but these are the challenges for the whole society in Ukraine. Of course, there are a lot of discussions about conscriptions and so on, but you know, I had a conversation with Polish taxi driver. He told me, look, there are so many young Ukrainian men in the streets of Warsaw. They flew from Ukraine. I said, yes, nobody wants to die, really. But what do you think about young Polish men? If someone would invade Poland, would they go to the front line? He said, no, no one will go. They all will flee from Poland. I said, yes, but thousands of Ukrainian men and women went to the front line, and only few of them flee from Ukraine. That is this difference. And think about Norway. How many of you will go to the front line in the case of invasion? How many women? How many men? I'm sure you have to think about it, because the threat of maybe not invasion, but some conflict situations are very close to Norway as well. Unfortunately, you also have the same neighbor that we do. And this is the threat for you as well.
If I may add just two points. First of all, it was actually Russian invasion that basically driven that changed in the equality and gender equality in Ukraine, because in 2014 many women volunteered to go to the armed forces, and it's actually them who have driven the change which resulted in the legislation changes and so on, because at the beginning there were no possibility to be in the combat positions. There were cooks and so on and so forth. There was a big campaign to actually recognize that, but right now, and the recent mobilization law was adopted, and currently, I mean, the situation will not change. So women can serve, and they do serve, but it's on a voluntarily basis that they go and signed to join the military, but also, I mean, they're not only in the armed forces, they are across whole security and defense sector. There are a lot of them, firefighters, you know, police, and so on and so forth.
That's we've come to the end of the podcast, and I would like to quote something that was said in the other episode I mentioned about the Spanish Civil War, because our Nordahl Grieg, who was very active when it came to the Spanish Civil War, he was also active in World War II. He had a quote something like that: "Either we support Spain today, or it will be our war tomorrow." And you could just exchange Spain with Ukraine, and we are where we're at. So it's a very, very relevant parallel to us now.
For sure. And I really want to thank Olena, Irina, Olga, and Katarina so much for taking time talking to us. So big applause to them, and a big applause to yourself for coming and sharing your night with us. Thank you so much. And thank you to Stopp Pressen for hosting us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Stopp Pressen for hosting us and also for the production. And thank you to Webium for the video editing if you're watching this on YouTube. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
I hope it was better than you feared. Yeah, I'm also very happy with it.